You probably know by now that what's keeping me busy during the pandemic is a lot of gaming. Today I'm talking about my favorite RPGs. Hello and welcome to Panelism, the podcast where we talk about the comic books and graphic novels worth having on your shelf, and sometimes RPGs. I'm Todd A.
Taylor Trask. Hey. And by RPG, you mean red, purple,
green.
That's right.
Yeah. Classic primary colors, red and purple and green.
That's right.
Yes, of course, we're talking about role-playing games. It may surprise people to know we go into those intros unscripted sometimes.
That's a shock. I don't want anybody thinking that. We carefully write. It takes a week for us to write each intro.
Oh
Todd.
my gosh!
Do not let them think otherwise.
The whole show, in fact, is so heavily scripted. It's
oh god, yes. You may not know it at home, but we have every single word and pause. It's all accounted for, all of it.
Even these interjections, even the laughter. It's all in the script.
Bingo.
And we rehearse sometimes 6-7 hours a day. It's grueling.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
We do it for you.
That's right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
There are some but wait. There are some podcasts that are that way. That's the sad part. It's like there are some podcasts that are so finely, like every little nuance and breath. I'm like, you guys have way too much time on your hands. Not for us.
I think it's the Wondery Network. Have you ever listened to their shows?
I think so. Once or twice.
They have a series. They actually I don't know if it was pandemic related, but I had to chop a bunch of series and stop producing them. They had a huge, vast number of series that were like the most soporific things I've ever heard.
Soporific. There's a word.
Yeah, but it was like the the satire of public radio of in 1934, Martin Freeman killed everyone in his household. And Jean's going to take over the diagnosis here. Please note, she's not a psychiatrist. It was just they were. I mean, I actually listened to a bunch of them because they were easy to just put on and zone. But I was not surprised when many of them got axed.
You're getting dangerous close to the BBC. What was my my fake
the Genesis?
I was about to, and I still can, and it can happen anytime. I was about to record a sort of a cliche BBC style show called The Prognosticators, and it was going to be sort of my tribute to the band Genesis, and it's like prognosticators, get it, prog rock. No, but I was gonna basically do all that, those same coming up on the prognosticators. Extended conversation with Stephen Hackett, the guitar player from Genesis from 1975 through 1979. We'll be back after this. And just that whole, I'll tell you this, those podcasts are actually really nice to fall asleep to because it's just, to use your word, soporific. Soporific or soporific? I haven't used that.
I said so soporific. Long. I don't know if that's that's a remnant of a southern accent. Because now that you say soporific, it does sound more like that's probably how it's supposed to be pronounced.
It's like when people pronounce ProPublica, and it drives me nuts. I'm like, it's ProPublica.
Oh Lord!
Do not say Publica like it's a. It sounds like too many things that aren't news related.
Yeah. Oh boy, I'm gonna try to keep it clean for this episode. Everyone knows I accidentally slip in F-bombs when I get frustrated with stuff or excited. I don't know. My emotions are very. There's very little change in them. It seems from excited to aggravated. So as we mentioned, we were talking about RPGs, which is not red, purple, green, but role-playing games.
Okay.
And this episode is actually we don't sorry to shatter this illusion, don't actually script these things so heavily in advance, but this is one where I took a handful of notes almost a month ago and was like, I'm ready to go. And at the time, this is one of the things I can't wait to touch on, is at the time I thought, I'm going to introduce this. I'm going to talk about how Dungeons and Dragons got me back into playing these things and how within 2 years of sort of picking it up, Dungeons and Dragons is now my third favorite RPG. And then the landscape has shifted even since I wrote those notes.
Well, let me ask, as a somebody who admittedly in many episodes, I mean, I had a couple entry points to D&D and they were so miserable that I just never quite acclimated to it. So like I'm coming at it from like the layperson standpoint or layperson's point of view. So is with D&D, I was going to ask you, because you said that was your main thing. Is it common for a lot of people is that the gateway drug to RPGs is D&D these days, or is that just one of many possible entry points that into the world of RPGs?
I think it's got to be. It's just the name recognition. Like that is the brand name, that brings people in, and so here, this is a theme that will run throughout this episode. And one of the specific reasons I wanted to do it was because you had such a, I would say, formative experience with D&D, and like in a way that turned you off of the experience, even if you were able to see some of what people might like about it, and we'll talk about that in depth, of course. But this is where it all sort of changed for me, was when I started getting into it a couple years ago. I'm pretty sure I told you, like, oh, I just love this system and they've simplified everything. And like, the thing is, you can play any game you want in the system. And that is the thing that has been expunged from my mind. I no longer think that the D&D D20 system is like the perfect system to play anything in. And then once I had that thought, it sort of radically changed the way I thought about your experience. And I went, oh, I can't wait to talk to Taylor about this, because maybe D&D isn't the RPG for him, but there's there's so many other things that you might be aware of from your D&D experience. It's like, how do we do this in a better system, Well,
I just want to clarify for those listening going, he didn't like D&D. It's not the fact that it was D&D specifically. It was that the groups I was with, the first one in particular, they had a twist on D&D that just was not for me. And then the second group I had sort of bombed in on, and you could tell that was like an established little tight trio. And I was sort of as I mentioned to you off air, I was sort of like the weekly guest host on a TV show. I was Ian McShane on Game of Thrones, which I pop up. I pop up and I'm like, I have a meaningful thing, but I'm done. And then the story is not hinged on me in any meaningful way. So it's just
at the end of the credits with Taylor Trask.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think that's the thing I'll get into. And so, without belaboring that, jumping into it anymore, I'll just give the quick background on my RPG stuff, because my RPG experience, because I do not want to claim to be some longtime player, but I definitely want to explain that there was like a gap. When I was 12-ish years old, I had some friends. We all thought that Dungeons and Dragons would be fun to play. One of them probably had an older brother that played, and that's what got us into it, because me, as a obsessive archivist, I still have like these AD&D character sheets that I wrote out that character on when I was 12 years old, and these like hilarious dungeon maps and stuff. I know there was a game store in Nashville, Tennessee, that I would go to, and I bought the red box and the blue box, and tried to make sense of this game, but it's just a classic case of like, never had a dungeon master to show me the ropes, take me through it. So me and my friends, we probably created those characters and drew up some dungeon maps or something, and then that was it. I'm pretty sure the same night that happened was the night I watched the movie Excalibur, which, like, for sex and violence reasons, like, changed my perspective on many things in the world when I was 11 or 12 years old. And it was, I guess Dungeons and Dragons, I associate those things together. Like, oh, this is a thing that's like too adult for me to get into or something. And then around that time, TSR, which was then the publisher of Dungeons and Dragons, released the Marvel Superheroes game. I bought the yellow box and the blue box of that. So like, that's like the beginner set and then the expert set. What I liked about Marvel Superheroes was it came with standees. So I spent all this time like cutting out these little standees and gluing them together. So I had tokens of all the superheroes that I liked. and then it had these really great maps that looked very much like a Marvel comic map. So I would have like a map of this building that would be, like 2 feet by 3 feet. And it was like, oh, I can't wait to play on this. But same thing. It's like the rules were just inscrutable for a 12 or 13-year-old at that point. And and it's just hard to get people together to get into this. So, but obviously my exposure to Comic Cons and podcasts, like I was hearing a lot of chatter about D&D, and I'd just been interested for many years. And I had some friends, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, were like forming a group at work, and I was interested in getting into that, but I was leaving that workplace, and it was sort of like I just kept missing the entry, and a couple years ago, maybe after a Comic-Con, maybe during a Comic-Con, I remember mentioning it to friends at Comic-Con, and my friend Chris saying, actually, several of us are interested in it right now. We just haven't taken the leap. And one thing is that we feel like we've got to know someone that wants to be a dungeon master. And so I thought, well, I'll do that. And I reached out to a friend of mine that I knew had been a dungeon master for like 30 years and said, hey, can you show me the ropes? And then that prompted his game group to start a game. So I joined that as a player and got to pick up on all his DM tips as a player there. And anyway, that's my introduction. And I wanted to get your exposure on the record because then I think I can bridge off of that, which is how did you first play this game? What was your introductory experience to it?
Well, after we sort of chatted about this over the a couple days ago, I was kind of going back through my personal history, and there were times as a kid that there were all these amazing sort of like pop up, you could send in and have like a, kind of a package of cool stuff sent to your house. It was sort of like the OG version of like kind of the bento boxes you can buy now, where it's like you'd get on a subscription service. And this was like in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And you'd get kind of these cool little kits sent to your house. And I remember a couple of those had sort of these games included that were very RPG-ish, even though they weren't officially titled that. So I've always sort of had this tangential interest, and then being a theater kid, I'm wired to love the idea of it, to be able to create these characters and have these interactions, almost like these little live movies, every weekend. Like everything about it seems like it would appeal to me. And then I get to college. In my freshman year of college, I lived in a dorm, and particularly with a person who's a great guy. I won't say his name. I don't want to embarrass him. But like this, he and his friend group played D&D religiously every weekend, every Sunday. They'd have a potluck, and they'd gather around, and there's about 12, sometimes 14 of them. There's a lot of them. And then they open invitation anytime I want to come down. Well, one of these, after a couple months of that, I was like, oh, you know what? I'm going to finally, let me join in because this looks fun. I come down there, and at that point in time, I think I was number 13 or 14 that day. And I didn't realize a couple of things about the way they played
in the game. That's your 13th or 14th, the 13th or 14th player in a game.
In a game, yeah. So right away, that's a big red flag that didn't occur to me at the time. Also, I didn't realize they play for at least 8 hours. And so, they have their lunch, and then about 1 o'clock they go, and they don't sometimes finish until 9 p.m. that on Sundays. And they sat down kind of in our common room at the bottom, downstairs in the dorm. And so that all of a sudden it was like, okay. And then I didn't realize the way they played was very, very, like the dungeon master was very particular. And so it turned into, about 2 hours, because I had to bail after 2 hours. I was so bored that I was just like, I can't. I sort of did a kind of a, is it a Minnesota goodbye where you just kind of sneak out without anybody knowing that you've left? I just like, hey, I go to the bathroom. I just never came back. Because I just didn't know how to tell them that this is the most boring thing in the world, because it was like having a choose your own adventure book read to you, and you don't get to choose. And so I just sit there because like I would roll and I'm like, well, I'm going to do this. Or like, actually, you can't do that because this. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that just kept happening. Like I didn't have any agency as a character whatsoever. Like even the way my character was designed had to fit very specific
Oh, Lord.
Everything about it was just very, very like I didn't know why they thought it was fun to do that for 8 hours, and it was not at all. Like my understanding of D&D was sort of the Stranger Things presentation, like a smaller group of people really getting into it, very collaborative. And the dungeon master is almost just kind of like kind of the default, but like it's not, they're not sort of creating this dictatorial, authoritarian game situation. So that was like the first time, and then the second time I got roped in was in Tennessee in Nashville at Belmont, and there were these 3 guys who had been playing, kind of together for a long time. And they're like, hey, we think you might have fun. And I did, but it was very clear that like that group had really established kind of a shorthand, and like, they were into a very particular story that, again, I was just the guest star that week. So, it gave me a taste of what, a better version of it, but I was like, I really need to start from scratch with people like this, where I can kind of build a rapport and a history. And so I've been sort of drifting since then, not really having that, that group of people.
What were the like, how long ago was the first experience? And then how long ago was the second experience?
20 years ago for experience 1. That was 2000. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It was 2001. So 19 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And then the second one was 2004.
Oh, okay.
4. So, cause I was still in college, and I was just like, let me try again. And then it's been a while since then.
And you said something in there that I wanted to pick up on before circling back to those dates, which is that you were a theater kid, and so you were wired for this. Yeah. And that is honestly like a stumbling block for a lot of people who are in the geek world like me, because I definitely went into it thinking, I'm not a theater kid. I don't want to go, quote, role play. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I loved all this geek stuff and these geeky genres. And certainly things like Game of Thrones and Stranger Things came around and put, I got into them, and then I was like, oh, I guess I could deal with medieval fantasy. That was another stumbling block for me. It was like, do I want to play a medieval fantasy game? So that's a great point, because I hope that there's so much to touch on in this episode. We can't get to it all, but I would definitely love to talk at later times, or to people personally, that's like, you don't have to be that theater person and feel that you need a stage presence in order to play these games. Like, it's great, and I totally think you're right on with like that wired for it thing. But there are, so I really appreciate you bringing that up, and I think there's an important counterpoint, which is like, hey, even shy geeks that may feel like they're not theater kids can enjoy this.
Well, let me throw one more thing in the fire. So like, as you're saying that, I'm reminded when I was a little kid, 0 to 7, I big He-Man fan, and I used to get together with my friends on the weekend and bring my and we'd all we'd have this, we'd pick somebody's house, and we would have set up these epic sort of He-Man like playtime storyline kinds of things. And sometimes G.I. Joe would slip in every now and then as like kind of an Elseworld sort of story, but like we'd spend like 2 maybe 3 hours like planning everything and like creating this, okay, when I do this will happen over here. So we're basically playing D&D with toys. And if it wasn't that, it was like outside, kind of creating these like, okay, in this scenario, and like basically doing like live action LARPing kind of sort of hybrid. So like it's not like I'm not ready for. I think maybe because those experiences were so tactile, so collaborative, and so just like of a certain thing, when I got into a very systematized, it almost felt like we might as well have been doing our taxes in character. Like that's what that first experience felt like. It was just so tedious, and just that was what I didn't expect, and didn't realize that some people played with that level of just tedium and detail, and just. It was of a certain, there was just a certain kind of hum. So I have not, if our listeners don't know, I have never seen you run a game or DM a game. Like, so I would love to see, or even just experience kind of how you set it, because I'm sure it's a much better experience than what I dealt with.
Well,
that first time.
I love all of this. This is such a perfect experience. And the reason I asked about how long ago it was that you played these games, this also ties into your opening question, which is like, is D&D just the, how is that just the when you think of RPG as a D&D, is that what people have to get into the next thing, And the answer now is no. Like, it doesn't have to be your entry point anymore. It's definitely the brand name. But the reason this is opinion. I think the reason you're hearing of it so much more these days, and the reason that it has swelled in this popularity, is because in 2015 they released the 5th edition of it. So that means that you and I, our exposure to it was not under the 5th edition. In 2001, you were probably in 2nd edition at that point. This has become a big thing. I am not the nerd to answer all these things, as I love nerding out on it, but I definitely don't know all this information. But a big seismic thing happened in D&D around the release of number 3, and pardon me, nerds, if I'm screwing this up, but 3rd edition, I think, is the first one where they converted to what they called the D20 system, which meant that you're going to roll the 20-sided die for almost every check, every attack, everything. It made things so much simpler. You're not rolling specific dice based on your class. You're all rolling the D20 for any ability check you want to do. The DM says, make an athletics check to see if you can clear that gorge. You roll the D20 and add your athletics bonus. That's it. So it made it so much simpler. And then all the other dice became things like damage or healing or, odds or, like random table stuff. So yes, the fighter and the cleric roll the same die to see if they hit something, but then they're going to have different damage dice because the fighter is going to have a bigger one, whatever. That was a big shift. And the second thing they did there with the release of 3 was that they open sourced a ton of material.
By open source, what do you mean? Like, what do you...
They made the entire D20 system open sourced. So, and they don't use that. They use open gaming license, and they talk about these system reference
when you
doc.
say open source, like we're kind of veering into like Scientology technology terms, because like when it's not a software program. Well, but
no, it is a software.
Okay.
Think software. Don't think Scientology.
But I'm saying, but open source. But like, are we talking about like the physical books and manuals and stuff? Like, you can just like define open source for me, because I'm having.
Yeah. Great. In that system reference document, that is basically a manual for how to play D&D. That is completely free online for you to read and learn from, and also build your own games from.
Oh, okay.
So when they did that, and this is more of the story I would love to find out, and I'm sure it's a couple Googles away. I just haven't done it yet. So they do that around version 3, and then they get this weird feedback for 3. I guess the old school people didn't really like 3rd edition or something. So they quickly release 3.5, but they don't use the same team that kicked this off, the open sourcing and the D20 system. That team says, screw you, Wizards of the Coast. And they go to Paizo and create Pathfinder. And Pathfinder becomes the spiritual successor to D&D. And then strangely, this is the part of the story I don't really understand. It ends up becoming the crunchier one, not the more open one. Pathfinder is basically like D&D with all the like 3rd edition crunch. So what I'm thinking is that you came in for that first experience around that time, and then your second experience was probably in 3rd edition or so. And you were in all of this crunch and all of this like perplexing details of things, where it does become like doing your taxes. So 4th edition, I don't know much about, but it continued the sort of like splintering of the group. So all of this to say, one of the many reasons, like there's the D&D faded out of our consciousness and then came back in, is because they simplified the system and made it better. So with 5th edition, it became a user-friendly game. And because it had that, now it was building on all the open source stuff, it also became a game where third parties had all of this material to work with. And now that they had a simpler rule set, it was like, oh, we can all make adventures. We can make magic items. We can make maps. We can make, so it became this super, super rich game, like in 5 years, it is now.
What's so fascinating about that is I had assumed that's what it was this entire time. I thought it was like, it's just kind of this open source thing where people were maybe you buy a starter box or something, but you were just, you could mess with it to your liking. I mean, weren't there not?
And you certainly could.
Yeah. Okay, I was gonna say it's not like there's not like a D&D police going around to houses like, are you playing with an officially licensed product? Let me ask you this though, because
Right.
this is something
Not
we
to
touched on.
houses, but I think
What?
it made it harder to sell those things in stores. So you had a game shop. Well, everyone's making homebrew D&D stuff, but it's having to be circulated in like zines and stuff. Of course, it all also, you think 20 years ago, it's the internet is just beginning to become ubiquitous. And so all of this comes up with the rise of the internet. And it just wouldn't make any sense for D&D, for Wizards of the Coast, who owns D&D, to have that old school mindset of like, hey, you can't sell our stuff in shops or whatever. So,
Well, we've touched on this. When did the Wizards acquisition occur? Wasn't that in like the last 5 years or so?
No. Actually, I think it was in the 90s.
What? Are you serious?
I
Let's look this
think
up.
3 and 3.5 may have happened, but I definitely appreciate the fact check on that. But anyway, that I think is like that also, if you're I think there was a stigma too. I can even remember like 5 years ago, Comic-Con, it was like there's the comic book people and the video game people, and then it's like, and then the role playing people and the LARPing people, and it was like they were still a little disenfranchised from the like mainstream geek crowd. And I do think some of it is because these games were, as I said, to reuse that word, inscrutable. Like, unless you have this whole culture behind it, you're coming to it and going like, God damn, oh, of course there occurs. You're going, how much math do I have to do to learn this game? How many tables do I have to keep? Why am I doing my taxes?
By the way, quick
yeah.
fact check. So you're right. In 1997, TSR, the original publisher, was bankrupt almost, and Wizards of the Coast swooped in. And then they spent 3 years developing third edition, which came out in 2000. So that third edition and beyond was all Wizards of the Coast sort of midwifed, essentially.
And so you were in this weird Dark Ages time where, like literally, where like if you came along in 2000, your group might have not even, like, they may have just gotten the third edition books and they're still trying to make it compatible with AD&D or some Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And that was a problem D&D had forever, because when I came in with like the red box, I always assumed, because I had this red box that everyone had called like basic set, and then there was a blue box called expert rules. And what I understood at the time was the blue box was what the DMs bought. Like, that's what your dungeon master buys. But the red box is like what everybody gets to learn how to play it. That's not really the case. Like, it just, they just never had a set. There was Dungeons and Dragons, and then there's Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and there was, it just, it wasn't codified in a way. It was not that source code kind of like open source software thing of like, this is the source code that runs this game. You're constantly learning these weird little like, ad hoc rules or something, and which on one hand, can make a really rich game experience. But you just got to admit, like, that prohibits new players from joining because they don't know where to start. They don't know what the entry point is. And 5th edition really clarifies all that. And they have done such a good job of making those entry points like really, really clear and open to people. Like, there's a website called dndbeyond.com, which I don't think is managed by Wizards, but is licensed with them and heavily like together. So you can actually buy all the books digitally there and then share them with your players in a campaign. And so everyone has access to all the materials you have. They have, you character sheets that they'll just build the character like with you. So you're not having to keep up with like, what do I add to the thing with the other thing? And it just like does all the addition for you. So in some ways, it's preventing people from learning all the intricacies of the game, but it's definitely like quick starting people into it. Like, hey, jump into this, see if you like it before you start buying all the books and figuring out that stuff.
That's cool. That's really smart, because you can, you can assume you might like it, but again, the people you play it with, sort of your flavor of what you go. Let me ask you this though, is there I'm just trying to kind of put my history together here, because this has been, I didn't realize all those, that kind of that 3rd edition and that 5th edition especially were so pivotal. Can you draw a clean line between the open sourcing of D&D and sort of the explosion of tabletop gaming we've seen in the last, let's just say 10 years. Is there a marriage between the two? Like, did one kind of fuel the other, or was that just a nice coincidence? Because we've seen, Jesus, Settlers of Catan and beyond, like that whole thing exploded around the same time, it seems like. Or am I trying to lump too much together?
I love that you bring that up, because I actually had a note to bring up something similar, which is in those days when, like, so even though I think of myself as like, well, I guess I just wasn't an RPG kid. I was interested. I wanted to get into it, but it felt like there was some sort of roadblock to it. Mm-hmm. But in those days when I was going to the game store, I would buy these just weirdo games, especially from Steve Jackson Games, who everyone knows now because there's a game called Munchkin that says Steve Jackson Games on top of it. And Munchkin has 1,000 versions, and has like a very D&D similar version of it. But you can buy like an Axe Cop version of Munchkin or a Batman version of Munchkin or something. It's like a card and dice and board game sort of thing. But Steve Jackson had made these sort of RPG, if not totally RPG, but RPG adjacent games. So I used to play Car Wars with my friends, where you would build a car with all these weapons on it, put it in arena. It was basically Twisted Metal on paper. And he also had written these choose your own adventure books where maybe I shouldn't say he wrote them. I don't know if Steve Jackson wrote them, but they were Steve Jackson game books where you created a D&D sort of character and went through your choose your own adventure, rolling dice and subtracting your hit points from your character and stuff like that. And those I loved. Like, that was such a big part of my childhood, was reading these books, and getting to take different adventures every time. So that was very formative. And then my friends and I also played this game called Axis and Allies, which I bring up because that was the first game where you got to roll like a buttload of dice. Mm-hmm. So you would, you put your army together, you'd start a battle, and you're like, I got to roll 15 dice for this.
Oh my God.
And it was, you brought up the explosion of tabletop gaming. And I think I'm just trying to like circle around on there. Yes, we're probably both trying to lump too much together, but I was just trying to bring up that, like, when I was a kid, when you thought of board games, you thought of Clue, Monopoly, Sorry, whatever. They were kind of dull. You'd done them as a kid. You're like, I don't, I'm a tween. What do I play now? And for me, that variety was in these weirdo RPG and RPG adjacent games, where you didn't necessarily need a game master to run it, but you were still sort of creating something original, and like there's that creative play in it. And I do wonder, I don't know that you can track the open sourcing of D&D to the explosion of tabletop games right now, but I think it's the same instinct of like, there's this whole generation of people who grew up with that as their background, and they were like, you know what? I want the creativity and fun of Car Wars in an easier to play package, so it almost looks like a Clue board game, like Catan.
Yeah.
Catan, you pull out the pieces and you put it together, and like you're playing on a board with things that you understand. This is the person that this is the settler I place on the property, and this is the 6-sided die I roll. These are cards. Like, there's nothing there that doesn't make sense to you. It's all like in the paradigm, but. But I do think that creativity must have come out of that generation of people who came up thinking like, board games are boring and RPGs are inscrutable. How do I like put these things together and get this creativity bubbling? And that is also a great segue into, like I said, I would have told you a month ago D&D was my third favorite game, third favorite RPG. And then had an experience that flipped it back up to number 2. And what's funny about that is I think even at Comic-Con last year, I was telling a friend like, well, we're going to these RPG panels, but honestly, I only care about D&D. And then even there, I'm like shopping for other RPGs while I'm saying that. So it was clear, like, I'm about to fall into this rabbit hole. I just don't know it yet. But there's a really great game. And this is one of those games where I think you would really like this game, and it is called an RPG. It is called, it's in the genre of RPG. It is called Blades in the Dark, and it combines a lot of the mechanical things that you might do in a board game with the role-playing aspect.
Okay.
And so then that author also had the, foresight and everything to just open source his rule set, at the beginning. And I heard an interview with him where I think even his like web developer suggested it, like, hey, if you want to just make a system reference document, I can easily pull this out of the doc, and so quickly made a website that just has the system. So it doesn't have, it doesn't have all the flavor of Blades in the Dark, because Blades in the Dark has a real specific noir, like Victorian noir kind of setting. But and I'm happy to dive down that rabbit hole as far as you'd like to go. But just to give you an overview of the mechanics, you create a character that's in a playbook. So rather than thinking like class and race, a problematic term from D&D, that doesn't make a lot of sense in Blades in the Dark. You're a class, but it doesn't like define you. Like if you're in D&D, the thing is like all those little rules and crunchy bits end up okay. If you want to be a fighter, well, you probably don't want to be a gnome, because the gnome isn't going to give you a boost to your constitution or your strength, which is what you're going to need as a fighter. So it's sort of like in D&D, you get in this meta gaming head of, well, the class of character I want to be is going to inform what sort of race of character I choose because of their attributes. Now, that said, D&D is about to change the way that you create characters, and hopefully getting rid of the term race altogether and going with something like ancestry or folk or something like that. But there's still ways that, if you want to be an archer, like a ranger, you're probably going to go with an elf, or you could go with an elf because that's going to give you a dexterity bonus, and that's going to help you hit with ranged weapons, etc. In Blades in the Dark, you don't have to think about that. You can take one of their playbooks that looks like, say, a magic user, but you can like stack it full of like melee combat. It doesn't matter what sort of class you play. You get to your skills and attributes. You can just distribute how you want. That class just gives you access to a couple of special features. Okay. So, and because it's all on this one sheet that's like laid out, like this is such a product of the information age. These things are designed, and I say this with complete affection, they are designed within an inch of their lives. Like the play sheets are perfect. You can print out one sheet and have everything you need on it, equipment, your stress level, your stats, like everything. And what Blades in the Dark does is you narrate a scene like you would in any role-playing game. The GM, the game master, does. The players tell what they want to do. So there's no more dungeon master telling players to do a thing, like what you said about the choose your own adventure that's being read to you. The game master in Blades in the Dark doesn't say, make a perception check. It's up to the players to say, I want to gather information here.
Great.
And then they put together a pool of 6-sided dice based on how many like points they have in particular skills. And they roll that pool, and all you're looking for is a 4 to 6. That's a success. A 1 to 3 is a failure. So that helps you push the fiction forward right away. So there are these really specific instructions. Well, not even specific. They're just the really emphatic instructions to players that are, it's your responsibility to push the fiction too. So it's not up to the game master to have all these details put together. You roll those dice. So even though a 4 to 6 succeeds, a 4 and 5 are a success with a consequence. You roll this pool of dice, you look for the highest number. That highest number is a 5, and the GM says, ooh, you succeed, but there's a consequence. Well, the player can come up with that consequence. You know what? I break my skeleton key off in the lock, so I can't use that again. So it's like I get the door unlocked, but I broke my master key. And so it becomes this more collaborative storytelling thing. And the reason I jumped into Blades in the Dark is because there are these, what my friend Chris actually pointed out to me are very board game elements of, there are phases to the game. So like in a lot of board games, you'll have that, like, this is the draw phase. We all draw a card. This is the build phase. We all put our settlers down. This is the, fight phase where we all roll our dice or something. Well, in Blades in the Dark, you have your planning phase, your, what do they call it? I can't believe this just slipped out of my head. Your score phase, and then your downtime. And score is because Blades in the Dark is built for you to play scoundrels.
I was just about to ask, because it seems, and I've got their website, the bladesinthedark.com, does a really good job of just kind of giving you all the stuff in website format. But as you were talking, I was like, this sounds like a game of D&D where everybody's chaotic neutral, which kind of sounds amazing. And honestly, is the form of D&D I've always wanted to play, which is everybody's kind of, you can align. It's like Suicide Squad. Like, you can align with other people to get something done, but you're always looking out for yourself. So there's a bit of a competitive element between all the players individually, as well as the players having to like kind of form together to get stuff done. I think a better metaphor is probably the game show Survivor, which is like, hey, you're on a team, but you're constantly trying to be the kind of the last man through. And I just like the idea of, a bunch. Yeah. You're always kind of looking over your shoulder in the gameplay, which that just appeals to me.
And although it is not every person for themselves, it is. That what you identify as chaotic neutral is definitely like leaned into. Great. Because I like that. There's such great mechanics in it. Like you don't have hit points. You do have levels of harm, but you also have this separate track called stress. So you can always push yourself to take more dice. Okay, say you're in fighting, their skill for fighting is called skirmish. You need to fight somebody, so you have to use skirmish, but you only have 1 point in it. So that means you can only roll 1 die. Well, you can push yourself and add another die. So I can say, I'm going to take 2 stress, push myself, and basically purchase that second die. So now I have a better chance of rolling a 4 through 6, when I fight this person. Mm-hmm. Now, it's one great thing of that, like as hopefully I touched on, but I don't know that I've specifically said, is 1 roll determines that outcome. Now, because you're not whittling down hit points, combat can just be 2 rolls of dice, which can be great because you're not spending literally an hour, which is what D&D generally takes to fight out 1 minute of combat, So you take this stress level, and then one of the cool mechanics is if you fill up that stress track, you take a trauma, and it's up to the player to choose from these traumas. And the traumas are very like subjective. And what they do is just give you a layer to your character. So you can take the trauma cold. And so you have to play that character like, I'm cold. I don't show any warm emotions. Like what the stress I have taken has rendered me sort of emotionless. The better you play into that trauma, the more experience points you get, which of course adds to your skills, etc. So you max out that stress track again. Now you take the trauma paranoid. So now you're like an emotionless paranoid person. The better you play that. So I think that feeds into exactly what you're talking about of being those chaotic neutral characters who have to sort of look out for themselves, even if they're in a crew. Yeah. And your ultimate goal is literally retirement. You're just trying to put enough coin in your stash so that you can retire, because the worst thing that happens is that you I can't remember if trauma can max you out. I think there's only so many traumas you can take. So you take too many traumas, like you're just a vegetable, and like you are incompetent at being a thief from now on. And so you retire with what you got in your stash. That could just be 10 coins, So I would have told you this was my second favorite game or tied with my first. I have, in all honesty, only played 1 game of Blades in the Dark, but I have played several games of its sci-fi spin-off, which is called Scum and Villainy. Okay. Which is like, because they open sourced that system, they had this sci-fi game come along right away by a different creative team.
Now pause real quick, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around this open sourcing of the games. You're saying that Blades in the Dark, just like D&D, open source kind of all their sort of mechanics and stuff. Meaning that if you and I want to go and create a game called Scum and Villainy, we can, and then sell it legally and actually like have it be accepted as sort of a spin-off of Blades in the Dark. Is that sort of the idea? Yes. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, there's normal open source is probably the wrong word, because there are sort of licensing, but it is an open game license.
So more like public domain, sort of light.
More like Creative Commons might be the better. So
perfect.
Instead of saying, for example, you can't say we base this off Blades in the Dark. There's just a legal thing that's like, you have to call it a Forged in the Dark game and use this logo, that kind of thing. Scum and Villainy was good enough to get picked up by the same publisher. So book of it looks exactly like Blades in the Dark, which makes this great, set. So I played a lot of Scum and Villainy, and in between us planning this episode and us recording it, ran a game of Blades in the Dark. And granted, I made a few GM mistakes, never mind. I made a lot of GM mistakes, which I was sort of trying to bend the game to my will. But it gives so much power to the players, and you are able to start without the players reading the book. Like, you can basically give them the quick start cheat sheets and the playbook, and they can get into it, but it does work best when your players are really engaged in playing this kind of game and want to do it on their own. Like, they're the ones who say, you know what, our next score should be hitting that gang that hit us in the last time, because you also keep track of like what factions you're at war with and stuff like that in this game. Mm-hmm. So it is best when the players are sort of driving that, but obviously to introduce people to it, you can't, you can't just give them all that to run on their own. So I had a predetermined scenario, and I think it went okay, but it was just my mistakes of like, oh, I can't adapt this scenario well enough to the rules and blah, blah, blah. And not that should make me disfavor the game. I just felt like it requires an investment, I guess, and probably a couple of sessions of sitting down with that group that sort of like wants to learn a new game. So I would say, like, once they get into it, it's great for one shots, because then it's like, oh, you can just like, you can say, we're playing Blades in the Dark, bring a character, and they can sit down, look at the city map, and go, you know what, we want to hit these people in this area, blah, blah, blah. And then the GM has a bunch of tables to roll on and figure out the details, and you're in it. One of the very cool things about it, I'll mention this other really cool mechanic in it, is that you don't spend a lot of time with the players planning the score. So, which is funny, because even though you and I as kids, like, we played those imaginative games where you're coming up with the whole, He-Man scenario that you're going to play out with your toys. Mm-hmm. That's definitely a part of D&D, is like, you're planning this whole thing, when you hit the goblin hideout, you're going to do all these, it's all this strategy and stuff, which is great, but it takes a while. Yeah, in Blades in the Dark, you just pick how you're hitting it. Like, you can say full on assault. You can say, nope, we're going to use deception, and we're going to try to pretend that we're somebody else when we go in the building. Or you can just try to break in the building. Now we're going to sneak in, or whatever. There's a list.
So wait. But if let's say it's agreed upon, we're going to sneak in, and then somebody like Leroy Jenkins at the last second. Is that allowed?
They can't.
They can't. Okay.
Well, you pick that plan, you pick the whatever it's called, the approach that's like how you're going to hit the score. So you just say, we're doing deception. Then you roll the dice, which is called the engagement roll. And depending on the success of that, you narrate what happened in the scene based on that. Okay. So so for example, the one shot I did with everybody was based on Die Hard. So they're hitting the Nakatomi Tower, which I like repurposed into this whole, weird Victorian noir setting. Well, if they said, hey, we're going to do it just like the movie, and we're going to hit with deception, and we walk in pretending, we're talking about the Lakers game, but then we're just going to shoot the guy at the last second, and they roll badly, then I would say, like, the guard notices immediately, and he pulls out his gun and, shoots you in the shoulder. Now you got a first level harm on your shoulder. Then we're like, you're in it all of a sudden. So it doesn't matter what these like best laid plans of like, my dwarf is going to, rappel down over here and blah, blah, blah. It's
my God. I like this so much more. You're in the action
right there.
Because that was my biggest frustration. Is that every move was like so defined out, like there was nothing spontaneous. Yeah. There was nothing like in the moment, and if there was, it was just to basically shut down. It was like the opposite of improv. Improv is like yes, and exactly. This was you'd be like, what about this? Like, nope. And they it's like they would roll something and just make something up to like shut down that idea, so that the very carefully very stringently designed storyline could take place. And I'm just like, dude, This is not interactive at all. This is, again, best analogy is a choose your own adventure book read to you, and you don't get to choose.
And the thing is, not only is that not fun for the players, but it's not fun for the dungeon master, because the dungeon master then has to think. And to me, the analogy I always use is like a Lord of the Rings. That's how I think of big fantasy. Okay. So, you put your players on this quest, but they might not necessarily know about it. You kind of nudge them like, hey, you got to go to this one place to meet this guy to pick up this thing. Well, if they don't go, it's easy enough to put that thing somewhere else that they do go to. Yeah. But you're constantly spinning out contingencies. Well, what if they don't do this? And I need them to pick this up to continue the story. Well, what's evident to me now is that in all these, especially indie RPGs, they're really built for everyone at the table to participate in that. So, as Bruce McCullough, the beloved kid in the hall, said about the Doors having no bass player, don't let that scare you. Let that free you.
I love that. That's a great.
That was my best.
That's a great. Now, when you say Kid in the Hall,
Right
are you talking about like the actual Canadian comedy troupe Kids in the Hall?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
They had a sketch called The Doors, where he's a record a store owner talking about like how great the Doors are. Quick question: who's on bass?
That's a great point. I never thought about that.
Wow, I've ruined my illusion by joking so much about how I made a great illusion. But yeah, I think the typical dungeon master looks at a game like that and goes, "Oh, but I want to tell this story."
Yeah.
But it's really like, for me, only being like a year and a half into my dungeon mastering career at this point, is like, that is such a chore. Like, there are things that I just dread about having to like prep all that stuff. And these indie RPGs allow you to go in with much less prep and really have fun playing the game, because that's what you're supposed to be doing as a dungeon master. You're supposed to be playing, So that was a perfect setup. You saying all that about how you love that and turning it into an improv game for my number one favorite RPG right now, which is the game Fate. And specifically its spin-off, which is called the Fate Accelerated Edition.
Okay.
Fate, it looks vastly different from D&D and even from Blades in the Dark. Specifically, first of all, because you're using 6-sided dice, so you're using cubes, but they're brought over from this other game called Fudge. So they're sometimes called fudge dice or fate dice. They only have 2 symbols on them, a plus or a minus, and then the third side is blank. So every die has 2 pluses, 2 minuses, and 2 blank sides. On every roll, you roll all 4 dice, add up the pluses, subtract the minuses, don't do anything with the blanks, and then you'll add a modifier like to it. So instantly, it's like a you got the familiarity of the dice, but you're not. You're not dealing with like numbers. There's like this immediate sort of weird thing of like, oh, I got to add up the pluses. Like I have so many players go, I got 2 pluses and 1 minus and 1 blank. And then I have to do the addition in my head, which is not fair. Players, you should learn how to do addition and subtraction.
That's what you hide behind your little board. You know how they have that sort of like that testing wall?
Yeah.
It's like you have a calculator back there. You got all your stuff.
Exactly. I don't mind. Bring a calculator to the game, players. It can only ever be a 4 or a -4. So it looks different, but what's really genius about this game? Let me give a warning up front. What is very complicated about the Fate core system, where you'll find like a 300-page book on this, is that it is written to be system agnostic. So it's written really for you to build the game at the table with your friends. You say, hey, you know what? We're going to do a steampunk game with airships. And then you all sit at the table and like collaborate on it. So the book can be really hard to understand until it sort of clicks for you, because the book is written like without any of the flavoring of that. They give basically 3 examples throughout the book. They give like a fantasy one and like a sci-fi one and a steampunky one, I think.
Okay.
So they're basically saying like, oh, well, say you're Zord the Incredible, blah, blah, blah. But the place where this gets really into that improv and stuff, and which is just so freaking genius, I love it so much, is that when you're creating your character, you don't just come up with like skills and like try to figure out like how battle ready you are and then leave the squishy stuff up to your imagination. The squishy stuff actually becomes part of the character. What you first do is you say, this is the high concept for my character. And that establishes a fact in the game. And these things will continue to be through the game as aspects. So if you are Taylor, the bravest sword in Colorado, that's the fact. You're the bravest swordsman in Colorado.
I am.
That is, and so you get to invoke that aspect to give yourself bonuses. The twist on that is in the game master or game mistress can also compel you with that aspect. So you walk into a battle with somebody that like it's clearly going to kick your butt. I can say, sorry, you're the bravest sword in Colorado. I compel you to fight this person.
I see.
And
okay.
so when you invoke it to give yourself a bonus, you pay a fate point. And when I compel you, I give you a point. So it's all about this like sort of point economy of like how many it's not a win-lose point system. It's just like you need an inventory to them. Think of them as like in D&D you have spell slots. So if you're a wizard in D&D, you can only cast say 5 spells per day until you rest and regenerate your magic. Well, that's sort of your fate points. I need to compel you more so you can earn more fate points. But then you do this great thing called when you're creating the game, where then you hand your sheet to the person next to you and say, what's our relationship? And they add an aspect to your sheet. And so you could say, I owe Todd my life, or I could write that on there for your sheet. You hand me your sheet. I write, Taylor owes Todd his life. So then all of us get to play on that. And that point economy works between the players. So the players can then like invoke or compel these aspects on each other and say like, hey, you owe me your life. I'm compelling you to jump down this ravine and save me.
Got it. Okay.
And so it does become that yes and game. And I think there's a big hurdle of learning how to talk about aspects in a fluent sort of conversational way in the game. But it is so, to me, it is just so much more engaging for everyone because you're always coming up with the facts of the story. So you have aspects in the situation you're in. You have aspects in the place you're in. You have like, you go into a haunted house and I can tell you some things like, oh, it's dark. So you could use that. You could say, hey, you know what? I'm going to invoke the aspect of the darkness and hide in this corner. Well, now you're going to get a +2 to your hiding, but you can also use your actions to create more aspects. So it just becomes this like you're all feeding off each other. And for me as a GM, it is the most fun I have had GMing a game, like bar none. So I think that's where Blades slipped in my mind is like D&D has all this preparation I have to do. Now I unfortunately have become like a bit of a rules lawyer on it and sort of enjoy pushing people on those crunchy things. If they do something that's better for the story, I'll always let the rules slide, rule of fun. But Blades in the Dark, at least my experiences with it are like, it takes too much to get the players up to speed. I think you got that engaged core group, going to be great. Fate is like, you could take just 4 good friends, sit them down with these dice and some blank index cards and make a game up that everyone's going to have fun playing.
Nice.
And that is the one I think you would have the most fun with, because I think your imagination would run wild on like not necessarily things that your character wants to do, but things that like your character is going to see in the room and invoke aspects and like bring things up for other characters. And like, then you all end up doing that and you're all contributing to this crazy story. So I know we're like running long and everything, but I wanted to tell you about 2 Fate games that I'm playing right now.
Okay.
One is the longest running one we've been doing for 4 months, 3 or 4 months already. And there's another RPG. I hesitate to mention this. It looks like a cool RPG. I wanted to get into it. I suggested it to this group of friends. Most of them had played Scum and Villainy with me. And I said, hey, I'm kind of interested in this game called Kids on Bikes, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's kids in the 80s on bikes. Now, it's very cool. It has a ton of cool mechanics. I do not mean to badmouth it. But at the time, boy, my players are about to learn something huge right here, which is I am not a fan of the genre Kids on Bikes.
Really? But wait, whoa.
They are all huge fans of this genre.
But when you say genre, are you excluding Goonies, Stranger Things, Paper Girls? Are you saying that you don't like that?
That's true. I love Paper Girls. Goonies, yeah. And Stranger Things I love. It's funny when I said it, my friend Ashley immediately goes, oh my gosh, I love the genre Kids on Bikes. And I was like, I've never really thought of that as a genre. That sounded like the funniest statement to me. But in my head, I was like, I guess what it is like, I I just wasn't. I don't know. I was curious about it, but I wouldn't put it as like, oh, I love all Kids on Bikes movies.
Were you ever a kid on a bike? I mean, I think part of that.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was a big kid on a bike, and I just that.
Yeah. Oh man, riding to the arcade. I shudder at like, how far I would ride to the arcade. That's such a crazy thing. Anyway, the Kids on Bikes game system has a very, very cool rules for all collaborating on a town and things like that. So what I did was, when we decided to play this, was I went to him and said, hey, let's do Kids on Bikes town creation, but I want to play the Fate Accelerated rules. Oh, I forgot to mention the other great thing about Accelerated. In Fate Core, like in the main Fate game, Fate Accelerated is like a 50-page paperback. It's $5. It's so fun to like just read this and go like, I could play this game. Fate Core is like the 300-page. This is the rule book. Fate Core, you have skills just like other RPGs, like D&D. They're a little bit different, but you have these hard skills. My investigation is a +3, and my driving capability is a +2 or whatever. Fate Accelerated swaps all that out for approaches. So before I got into these games, I had read this advice that said Fate Accelerated is great if all the characters are basically the same level of power. Like if they're all kids, or they're all astronauts on a space station where they have the same amount of training, because your approaches are like forceful, flashy, quick, clever, sneaky. So instead of saying, I'm going to use my fighting skill to fight this guy, you say, I'm going to punch this guy, but I'm going to do it in a sneaky way. And then you get to add that bonus. So that, to me, helps tell the story even better. Because when you have to think about how your character's approaching it, you start thinking in character more than you're thinking on the sheet of like the hard skills, So I think that adds to the aspect. So that's why that's the other reason I really love this. So we sat down and we went through the creation rules from the Kids on Bikes RPG. So we said, okay, it's in the 80s, and it's in a time where not everyone is walking around with a video camera on their phone. That's like stipulated in the rule book. So we picked 1986. We picked June 3rd, 1986, when they were graduating from their high school. We made up a town in Wyoming, although none of us has ever been to Wyoming, called Aberdale. And then I found like an RPG map of a town that was unlabeled. We dropped it in there. And then anytime they say something like, oh, we need to go to the Quickie Mart to get, we're playing pretty realistically, so they can't pick up dynamite there. But if they're like, I want to get some Jolt Cola, well, I did happen to name the 7-Eleven, but other than that, so I picked a bad example. But other than that, if they want to go to the occult bookstore, I say, what's the name of that occult bookstore? They tell me the name. Who's the owner? They tell me the owner. Where is it? They label it on the map. So it definitely takes all this burden off me.
Nice.
And then I get to play in the game just as much as they do.
Does that slow it down, though, because they have to like stop and think about it? Or is it just really quick, rapid fire, like whatever first? I mean, is there a time limit? Like, hey, you have 5 seconds to say the name.
It actually, I think, I feared that too. I think because it doesn't feel as like written down like a novel like D&D does, because it feels more like an improv like on stage thing. It's like the light shines on you and you just say the first name that comes to your mind, and that's it. That's canon.
Got it.
And we also lean really heavily into 80s references. So the occult bookstore in our town is owned by Ray Stans.
That's perfect.
So yeah, it's like
I love that.
And because of this, we have gone on this wild adventure, and there was definitely a point in time where I had to write down some facts about the town, just because I'm that person that's like, I have to have an overarching narrative kind of thing here. I just need a big secret that's going on in the town. Even though they told me what the big secret was at the beginning, I made it fit into a story somehow. Once I did that, then I was able to like contribute even more and like make up really wild stuff that they were doing. And I mean, it's seriously just been crazy. They've met a real life vampire. They've done some very Scooby-Doo antics, like they've solved the mystery of the missing, pets from the dog show. But they've also interacted with like the FBI. There've been plenty of like flashlight scenes. I don't want to give too much away, but they've fought ghost Nazis. And this is like really, for the most part, I mean, because we establish so many facts in the beginning and as we go along, and because we have this map that they keep adding to, it just allows it to get crazier and crazier and crazier. And because it's not a thing that I had to sit down and prep for, like in D&D, I'm not attached to my darlings here. So I'm not feeling like, hey, if you don't pick up the key in this town from this elf, then I've got to rework my whole story. You know, so for me, it's like, hey, I think of something cool. I just throw it in there just like they do.
That's cool.
And
I love this because we started with my sort of consternation about how I was introduced to this, and we end with kind of like, this sounds exactly like what I had wanted the entire time.
And see, that's why we told everybody at the start of this episode how heavily we script this, because this was all planned.
That's right. We came full.
No, it does feel like it was very ordered. And I won't get into the details of this, but I am also playing a D&D flavored game of Fate with my niece and a group of her friends. So tween girls, like from ages 9 to 13. And because we're doing the Fate rules, they get to roll 4 dice every time I say roll your dice, you know? So it's not like there is that sort of dice envy thing of like, you're in D&D and the fighter gets to like make 3 attacks. So they're rolling all these dice when it's their turn, and you're the cleric. You just roll 1 die or something, you know? Mm-hmm. So every time they get to roll a handful of dice and they get to talk about I didn't push them too hard on learning the rules. I would just talk to them in game about like, how do you want to do this? Do you want to be sneaky or do you want to be clever? But now they're getting it. And I gave them the sheets after we were several sessions into it. Mm-hmm. So now they're saying things like, I'm going to be forceful about this. And I get a +3 on my forceful.
Nice.
And it is just so fun. And because it's not so heavily scripted, if they take a wild left turn like they did last week and I have to deal with in a couple hours,
yeah.
I don't have to prepare too much for that. Because I can be assured, like, well, once we get into that cave with the snow leopards, they're going to take another hard left turn, and I'm not going to see it coming.
Yeah.
So we're all improvising in the moment, and I really just can't say enough good things about Fate. It is my favorite, and you can literally play it with index cards and 4 dice, and that to me is like such a huge thing. Now you can definitely like explore doing the maps and things like we're doing in our Kids on Bikes game, which we call Pubescence on Velocipedes. But you don't have to have all those things. You know, you're not as D&D is very focused on the gizmos and stuff that come afterwards. You know, I got to have my miniature and we've got to have all these maps. And, you know, we play in a game, my big D&D game, we play with 3D models. So there's like, you know, my friend Chris is printing 3D landscape for us to play on, and it's awesome. Mm-hmm. But it, you know, there's preparation.
Yeah.
And Fate is like, you can play it in a park in an afternoon, you know? And yeah, that's literally where I wanted to deliver you, which was to talk about like sort of these different models of games and say, this is the one I think you would enjoy the most.
I love it. That's a great, wow.
And
what a great journey. Yeah. What a great little
I'm playing Pubescence on Velocipedes with our friend Justin in Denver.
Oh, so, okay, well, real quick, let's touch on that. I'm sure it's not as fun as in person, but are you guys figuring out a way to make remote play, you know, via Zoom or whatever it might be, work or worthwhile, I should say?
There are tons of tools for this, and the biggest one that everyone knows, once you get into it, is called Roll20.net.
Okay.
And it allows you to have you're sharing a map, you've got a chat box right there. The chat box allows you to whisper to other players so that the whole group can't see it, but also to whisper to the GM. Roll20 allows you to roll the dice right there. It has the character sheets for like dozens of games. So we were able to say, hey, I'm playing a Fate Accelerated game, and it just made 4 character sheets for me, so they don't have to keep up with all that paper.
Yeah.
But I do miss, one of the specific reasons I wanted to start playing D&D was to have another analog hobby, because I felt like I've just got to unplug. And the lasting curse of this pandemic is that I can't be analog in almost anything. Like I've got to be online all the time. Mm-hmm. So there are definitely tools out there. I'll shout out what I think is great for DMs, specifically for like a Dungeons and Dragons type game, is this new website called owlbear.rodeo. Owlbear.rodeo.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay,
.rodeo is a top level domain, by the way.
Owlbear, AOWL, and then bear,
yes.
BAAR, .rodeo.
BEAR. Yeah, like there's a monster called the owl bear in D&D.
Okay.
And this is .rodeo. It is very old school tabletop-y.
Got it.
So you can upload your own tokens and stuff, but it's just such a quick way to say, hey, here's our battle map, and I drag over one of their default tokens that looks like a monster. Here's your monster. Here's you. What do you want to do? And in Roll20, it has so many features that it's, you can turn on lighting for different rooms and measure distances and stuff like that. And you can do some of that in Owlbear, but Owlbear just lets you start playing really quickly. Whereas
Nice.
Roll20 is, again, like as the DM, you've got to prep.
Hey, can I ask
But
you?
yeah.
So real quick, and one more sort of, and this may be a longer answer, and if not, just try to keep it concise. Is there ever a game? And I think the last game you mentioned is probably this, but like, are there more common games where the DM or GM can be fluid, meaning like you can be GM on 2 games, and then it's like, I'm going to step aside and let Sarah take over. Is that a thing? Do you see that evolving that way, or does it really just need to be one person consistently in some of these newer sort of
honestly,
arrangements?
I don't have experience with that, and that I will actually definitely do some investigation into what is the best system to trade the game master position, because I've read that in a few. I know the guy that wrote Blades in the Dark, he has a new game called Agon, Agon, and I believe in that you swap the role, but it's much less like adventure, and you're playing a role that's specifically about a combat event. You are all it's meant to be like you're all Greek heroes, making a tribute to your gods. So you like sail to this island and you challenge, whoever's the toughest person, and so you're role playing in this, but you're kind of proscribed in what you're doing. So and I think that game is specifically built to change the game master each new island. Mm-hmm. But I just don't know of a lot of systems that are like built with that in mind. And that said, I bet there are games that are built with that in mind to make it an easier. I can see that happening in Fate for sure. I can see.
My point with this is there are some people who are incredibly talented dungeon masters or game masters. I'll keep using GM like you do. So there's people that are incredibly talented at it and good at it, and it's like, oh, it has to be Bob, it has to be or Todd has to be my GM. But I just kind of feel like especially with some of these more improv-y sort of adjacent kinds of games, and they're a little easier, and they're you can kind of it's less cruft, and just more playing. Like I would imagine those would be more fun if every episode, quote unquote, every time you guys play, like there's a different host. Yeah. Almost like with a TV show that's there's a template, but every director on an episode kind of brings a little bit something different. Like Taika Waititi's Mandalorian episodes are a little different than Jon Favreau's for good reason. And so like I almost imagine, because there is so much connective tissue between really great TV series and really great RPGs. Yeah, I just would imagine it would be kind of, that should be an ideal that people, in short of having just like that just killer GM. I would love to see that evolve too. That'd be kind of fun.
And I would say it's very easy to do that in both Fate and the Blades in the Dark games. Yeah. And one of the things that like Scum and Villainy was honestly the first Blades in the Dark based game I got. I got that first and then got Blades in the Dark. So, one of the things both of them do, but Scum and Villainy got my attention right away in emphasizing this game is an episode of a TV show. Yeah. Yeah. You plan your score, then you have your score. That's Act 2. And then Act 3 is your downtime. And so that's when you this is such a great mechanic. You indulge in your vice in order to reduce your stress. Oh. So you're supposed to role play that out. That's where it does become more of like a board game where you're rolling dice and it feels like, oh, we've got to do, you feel like you've got a checklist of things I got to do, but it can become more of a, role playing opportunity. But yeah, I can see both of those games, Fate and the Forged in the Dark games, becoming like, yeah, okay, in next week's episode, the person that GM this time is going to be a player and someone else is going to take over. Nice. Yeah, man, I love thinking about that because I'll definitely do more investigating on that because it is so intimidating to want to play Dungeons and Dragons and think we've got to find one of our friends who's willing to do literally 20 times the homework that everyone else has to do.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. It's like you just feel like, every adventure you pick up says, please read this adventure from start to finish before you start playing. And you're like, oh my God, it's 400 pages long.
Yeah.
Even if it's a 20-page adventure, that can be daunting to like, I got to read this and I'm trying to keep all these details in my head before I go back and start it over, even though we're only going to get 2 pages through it. It's like, dude, that's a lot of prep. So fortunately, there are tons of RPGs that do not require that prep, and thus I think are much more fun for the game master and the players, honestly. So if you're in Dungeons and Dragons, and like just a quick example, you get knocked down to 0 hit points. Okay, so the next round comes around. This is one of the few opportunities in the game where everyone's rolling dice every round. You're in a battle. Someone gets knocked down to 0 hit points. They're unconscious. Their next turn comes around. They just have to roll to see if they don't die. Well, in Fate, there's a mechanic that's like, if you see that you could possibly be knocked out on on the next turn, because you've taken all your stress, you can choose to leave the action. And not only do you get to narrate how you leave the action, but you earn a fate point.
Oh, I love it.
Now, if you don't do that and you stay in the action and get taken out, then the GM, and specifically the NPCs that they are controlling, gets to choose how you get taken out. So it can be terrible. So it's like it becomes a better storytelling device, which is like, you're not just like at 0 and you have to sit there and like roll one dumb die and see if you pop up with 1 hit point. It's like an opportunity to tell more of the story. And that's just what makes Fate such a great, game for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Love it. Wow.
Woo!
Oh, I got more out of this, and not that I was not looking forward to it, but I got more out of this than I anticipated I would, because I just didn't realize. I think a lot of people are in my boat, right? People who are, but by every definition, should love RPGs in this way. But I think because of either circumstances or more likely lack of knowledge, because even if you walk into a comic store that has a lot of RPG and tabletop stuff going on, it's hard to just like, where do I even begin? Like, where do I even start?
Yeah.
And I think having kind of a guide like this to kind of just keep you updated on like where things are and what's available, and like most things in this day and age, the decentralization and sort of the Creative Commons-ization, if you will, of these things, I think has been a really good thing. And it's just allowed more creativity, more variations, more experimentation. That's the biggest, kind of the most fun thing I've heard. It's just there's a lot of experimenting going on, a lot of kind of iteration, which is cool. I also can't wait for... because I know we've talked a little bit too about, there are some great podcasts that are built on playing the games in real time, or designing games to be, podcast sort of enjoyable. I am looking forward to the day where all of this new media, all of this kind of innovation, everything kind of comes together into a singularity, if you will, of RPG, where it's maybe there's like a digital component, and then like you're there in person too, but then there's also like you can have somebody, in Singapore, videoed in and they're playing, but there's their version's like a little different. Just having kind of this confluence of all this stuff, because while I appreciate that you can do something with just index cards and dice and have a great time, I want to see how you can add on to that without making it, because the temptation is to go back to where we were, where everything is so convoluted and so complicated that technology just makes that worse. Technology just adds on more interesting, engaging elements, but it's still a simple experience. I think that would be amazing to see.
Yeah, and again, like D&D is probably my second favorite game, and one of the things that's great about it is once people do get into it, it is a shared language. Yeah, and you could pretty much drop someone into any setting in D&D, and they're going to understand how to play. Now, you might have some homebrew rules or something, but it's basically the same, and that is one of those like beautifully global things of, you could have players in Singapore and Melbourne and California, and you're all playing the same game online on Discord and Roll20, and it makes sense, and people are doing that. And with those more homebrew, like the Fate thing of like all the collaboration, that's probably hard to do without close friends, so it may lead to a more satisfying experience, but it's rarer. But I'm so glad you got out of it, because I knew, having known a little bit about your exposure to it, and then my deep exposure to multiple games during the pandemic, I knew we had something. I was like, I know I have something to tell you, and so I knew this would be a good episode to like lay all that down. So I'm really glad we got to do this.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, wonderful. Well, if you want to hear more of our episodes across a variety of topics, we've collected quite a few episodes over the years, and we're in the process of creating some playlists and some organization to help you figure out what's what. But we've got episodes about comics, movies, gaming like this, general chit chat, all kinds of stuff. You can go to panelism.inc. That's panelism.ink. And then that is also our Instagram handle at panelism.inc on Instagram. And then we're going to have, I think, more fun stuff coming as well as we kind of get back into the swing of things. It's been, it's 2020 if you're listening in the future. It's that year. We've been sort of suffering from a bit of a malaise. I'm coming out of it. As we get closer to autumn, I'm feeling my creative juices flowing again, which is good.
Well, we've talked about that before, about how our creative juices ebb and flow. And fortunately, I think for the podcast, they have ebbed and flowed in sync on a lot of times. And for me, especially dealing with being at home all the time during the pandemic, the freaking weather is such a factor that I know in the winter it's a factor, but seriously, the last month has been so miserable in my house, because it's California. I'm close to the beach. I don't have air conditioning. I don't have insulation. So when it's 95 outside, it's 105 inside. Oh, Jesus. And I got fans on me all the time. It's like, I'm just uncomfortable and I don't want to record. And so I feel that same thing. Sorry to whimper right there, but I feel the same thing. Like, we're going into autumn. I'm ready to make podcasts and other stuff.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. And just full disclosure, this is the summer of the wildfire everywhere in California where you are, in Colorado where I am.
And you too, yeah.
And we've had some pretty, just 2-3 weeks of just awful, hazy skies with brown-green colors, no clouds. You can't go outside. You can't open your windows. Finally, last Friday, that broke. Gosh. And now it's just been beautiful, 75-degree days with, just beautiful breezes and stuff. So weather is such a huge part of my sanity, and I'm just glad to be heading back into a place where it's like I can, breathe again and enjoy my day instead of adding one more thing to the list of 2020. Anyway, it's been a pleasure, sir. I'm glad we had this chat. Yes. I'm glad to have heard more about RPGs. I'll see you next time.
Red, purple, green.